Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time, did you? Or did you not use Rust-Oleum gloss enamel spray paint to cover the federal asset tag on a U.S. Navy boat? The man in the dark suit asked calmly, as two other agents stood behind him, arms crossed. Felicia Carmichael, in her pastel pink power blazer and matching heels, blinked at the clipboard as though it might bite her. She opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it. The color drained from her face, just as fast as it had bled onto the boat's hull 48 hours ago. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor's lawn sprinkler clicked on. And just like that, the neighborhood went from cul-de-sac calm to DEFCON 1. 2 days earlier, Jim Halloran had backed his truck into his new driveway with a satisfied grunt, his pride and joy hitched behind him. A sleek, gray, 42-foot Mark VI patrol boat with the kind of muscular curves that made retired SEALs weep. It was a retirement gift, sort of. Technically, the U.S. Navy still owned it, but he'd been granted long-term custodianship as part of the Cadet Marine Education Program. For Jim, it was more than just a boat. It was his past, his peace, and the last tangible link to a life lived on the edge of duty. To him, it was beautiful. To his new homeowners association, it was a 20,000-pound eyesore. He hadn't even finished unpacking when the first bright pink citation sticker showed up on the windshield of his truck. At first, he laughed, assuming it was a joke. Then he read the words, "Notice of trash and/or abandoned vehicle. Must be removed in 48 hours." He looked at the sticker, then at the boat, then back at the sticker. Somewhere, the universe was testing him. The president of the HOA introduced herself the next morning with the full confidence of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. Felicia Carmichael strutted up his driveway like she was auditioning for a reality TV show called Desperate Dictators of Suburbia. Jim was polite. At first, "This has to go," she said, pointing to the patrol boat like it was a burning couch on the sidewalk. "This," Jim replied evenly, "is an active-duty federal asset on a Navy lease program." Felicia squinted. "It's in violation of subsection 4B of the Property Appearance Clause. No non-functioning, non-commercial, non-passenger watercraft may be stored in front-facing visibility zones." Jim blinked. "That's not even a sentence." She didn't flinch. "You have 48 hours. After that, we tow." "Tow a Navy patrol boat?" Felicia smiled. "We've towed worse." He called his lawyer. His lawyer laughed. Then Jim called someone else, someone whose contact info wasn't saved in a phone, but burned into memory from years of black ops and bureaucratic wrestling matches. Lieutenant Commander Reese Langley, Pentagon liaison for the Veteran Equipment Oversight Committee. Within 12 hours, someone had sent a warning memo to the HOA. Within 18, it had been ignored. On the third day, Jim came home from the grocery store to find his boat's serial tag covered in white paint, the hull sporting a coat of mismatched gray. Felicia stood nearby, arms crossed like she was admiring a freshly painted fence. "Now it's not a federal asset," she chirped. "Now it's a neighborhood compliance issue." That's when the men in suits arrived. The agents weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The sheer fact of their presence, their dark sunglasses, the clipped radios at their belts, the way one of them made a note every time Felicia spoke, was enough to turn the neighborhood barbecue into a war tribunal. Felicia's voice cracked the second time they asked about the paint. The neighborhood group chat lit up like a Vegas billboard. "What's going on at Felicia's?" read one message. "Did Jim call the feds?" read another. Someone uploaded a picture of the suited men with the caption, "Boat Justice." Back inside his house, Jim stood in his kitchen, sipping black coffee like it was peacetime whiskey. He hadn't planned on starting a war with the HOA. But this wasn't just about his boat. It was about every veteran who came home to find that their service didn't buy them basic respect. It was about the way people like Felicia thought that a clipboard and a quarterly newsletter gave them power over others. Still, he'd be lying if he said he wasn't enjoying this. He looked out the window and saw Felicia pacing in her heels across the sidewalk while the agents took photos of the boat. One neighbor tried to casually mow his lawn while eavesdropping. Another pretended to walk their dog 3 times in 10 minutes. The situation escalated quickly when one of the agents returned with documentation, an official notice declaring the boat federal property under military jurisdiction, with an attached list of penal codes for defacement and unauthorized removal. The fine listed at the bottom of the form had more zeros than Felicia's HOA budget. She clutched the paper like it might bite her. By sunset, the gossip had reached the next cul-de-sac. Local news vans were idling at the development's front gate. A teenager on a bike pedaled by and yelled, "Hey, is it true the HOA lady's going to jail?" Jim watched it all with the calm amusement of a man who'd seen real war zones. He didn't need to raise his voice or pound on podiums. He had something better: paperwork, protocol, and the full weight of a misused federal chain of command. That night, his inbox filled with messages from neighbors, many apologizing for the HOA's actions. A few even offered to help him move the boat, until he clarified that moving it wasn't the problem. Unqualified suburban overlords with spray paint were. Down the hall, a photo hung on the wall. Jim in full dress uniform, flanked by his old crew, smiling in front of the same boat, now sitting in his driveway. He smiled at it, then turned off the light. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. Felicia Carmichael was not a woman who backed down easily. At least, not until someone showed up with a clipboard that outranked hers. The day after her unfortunate brush with federal agents, the entire HOA board was summoned to an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. It was the kind of place that normally hosted lukewarm coffee discussions about lawn lengths and holiday decoration rules. But today, the air inside was thick with panic, perspiration, and the unmistakable scent of impending lawsuits. Felicia stood at the front of the room in her signature pink power suit, though the confidence she normally radiated had taken on a more frantic flavor. A copy of the federal violation notice was projected behind her on a screen, and no amount of scrolling could shrink the text that said, "Defacing a federal asset. Penalty up to $250, 000, and/or imprisonment." Her voice cracked as she addressed the other board members, some of whom were already Googling how to remove their names from public records. "This is clearly a misunderstanding," she began, gesturing with the poise of a disgraced politician still clinging to their podium. "We acted within the scope of our community guidelines. The boat was unsightly. It was parked outside of the designated perimeter." "It is a Navy vessel," muttered Helen from the treasurer's seat, scrolling on her phone. "With a federal ID tag. You scrubbed off a serial number with acetone. Felicia, that's not a violation. That's tampering with government property." Felicia narrowed her eyes at her former ally. "We didn't know that at the time." "You were told," chimed in Greg, the secretary, flipping through a file. "Jim gave you documentation. You ignored it." Felicia scoffed. "You mean that crumpled piece of paper with a fancy seal? Anyone could print that." "Except it wasn't printed. It came via secure email from a.mil address," Greg said. "I checked the metadata. And now there's a federal investigation. Congratulations. You turned a boat into Watergate." Outside, the clubhouse parking lot had become an accidental press pit. Reporters from the local news station loitered near the hedges, hoping for a glimpse of Felicia or maybe an emotional neighbor who would say something juicy. A young intern even tried to sneak in pretending to be a yoga instructor offering HOA stress relief classes. Back at Jim's house, things were unusually quiet. He sat on his front porch in a rocking chair, sipping coffee and watching a pair of squirrels argue over a pine cone. His boat, freshly detailed by a well-meaning neighbor with too much free time, gleamed in the sun. A small sign now stood in front of it, reading, "This is not trash. This is federal equipment. Please do not decorate." He'd spent the morning fielding calls from old Navy friends, many of whom found the entire affair hilarious. Reese Langley, his Pentagon contact, had called again, this time laughing so hard he had to hang up and call back. Apparently, the Office of Naval Intelligence had flagged Felicia's name in a report about civilian interference with military property. The agents who had visited weren't from local law enforcement. They were from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS. Felicia had essentially brought a clipboard to a missile fight. Jim wasn't one for revenge, but he was deeply committed to education. So, when a few neighbors stopped by to ask what exactly the HOA had gotten themselves into, he sat them down and explained the chain of command, the classification of federal assets, and what happens when someone without authorization decides to paint over military property. He even offered printouts. By lunch, word had spread that Felicia might be in real legal trouble. Not just a fine or slap on the wrist, but actual federal charges. Meanwhile, back in the clubhouse, Felicia's grip on power was crumbling faster than a day-old croissant. The board had gone from nervous compliance to open mutiny. Helen had already drafted a motion to suspend Felicia pending investigation. Greg had started digging through budget records, suspiciously curious about an unexplained $$4,000 community enrichment charge labeled as hydration infrastructure, which, as it turned out, was a euphemism for Felicia's personal hot tub installation. "You can't just remove me," Felicia said, standing with her hands on her hips. "Yes, we can," Helen replied, handing over a copy of the bylaws. Clause 9, Section C. Any board member whose actions result in legal liability to the HOA may be suspended with a 2/3 vote. Felicia laughed bitterly. "This is all Jim Halloran's fault. He's manipulating this entire neighborhood." "Jim hasn't spoken at a single meeting," Greg said. "He hasn't needed to. You're doing the damage all by yourself." That night, the HOA posted an official statement online, trying desperately to spin the story. The HOA board acknowledges recent concerns regarding neighborhood compliance and is working closely with federal authorities to ensure all actions taken were within legal bounds. The internet was not kind. Within minutes, screenshots of Felicia painting the boat, taken by a neighbor's Ring camera, surfaced on a local Facebook group called Cul-de-sac. Someone had already turned it into a meme. The caption read, "When Karen tries to repaint government property, but forgets the Constitution exists." Jim's phone buzzed. A news producer wanted him on their weekend segment. Another message came from a legal fund for veterans that offered pro bono representation. He didn't need it. He wasn't the one in trouble, but it felt good to know someone was keeping score. The funniest part, though, was how polite everyone suddenly became. Neighbors who had previously given him side eyes now waved and offered brownies. One woman dropped off a lasagna and said, "My nephew's in the Coast Guard. Tell me if you need anything, except help hiding a body." Jim laughed. He liked this neighborhood a lot more when it was afraid of him. The next morning, Jim stood at his mailbox in his slippers when Felicia drove by slowly, her SUV crawling like it was being pulled by embarrassment. Their eyes met briefly. She looked like someone who had accidentally set fire to a library. He tipped his coffee mug in her direction with a nod that said, "Good morning, and also, nice attempt at treason." She didn't wave back. Inside the house, Jim chuckled to himself. The storm had only just begun, but for now, it was satisfying to watch the scales of justice start to tip. He hadn't needed to yell, threaten, or escalate. He had simply waited, let the truth come out, and allowed Felicia to hoist herself on her own pastel petard. He sipped his coffee again and muttered under his breath, "Semper Fi HOA." By the time Felicia Carmichael received the official notice of a federal inquiry, her carefully curated suburban empire was in tatters. The letter, crisp and unforgiving, arrived in a plain white envelope that offered no hint of the storm inside. The HOA board had already convened without her 3 times. Her parking space in front of the clubhouse had been reassigned to guest overflow. She tried to rally her remaining loyalists, but most of them had mysteriously developed spine conditions that prevented them from standing up for anything. Jim, meanwhile, was preparing for what he called the real war. Paperwork. He had no desire to drag this out, but he wasn't about to let the issue die with a fine and a shrug. This wasn't about personal pride. This was about precedent. If someone could deface federal equipment and hide behind HOA nonsense, what stopped them from targeting any veteran, any military family, any kid enrolled in the cadet programs the boat supported? There had to be accountability. Fortunately, Jim knew exactly who to call. Rita Pike was not your typical attorney. Her office was a converted RV parked at the edge of a defunct airstrip. She practiced law the same way Jim practiced military protocol. No shortcuts, no apologies, and no tolerance for fools. The first time he met her, she was wearing flip-flops, aviator sunglasses, and a "Don't Make Me Cite Case Law" t-shirt. She took one look at the HOA violation notice, squinted, and said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." Within a day, Rita had filed a preliminary civil claim against the HOA for unlawful tampering, reputational harm, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She did it with a grin, sipping cold brew from a mason jar and humming the national anthem under her breath. She had also filed a FOIA request on the HOA's finances and found some very interesting things. The Landscaping Improvement Fund included $1,900 in personal spa receipts, a $700 charge for community morale enhancement turned out to be a private wine tasting at Felicia's house with a motivational speaker who had previously hosted pyramid scheme seminars. The legal strategy was simple: make them sweat, then squeeze. The HOA's lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Barry Withers, clearly regretted ever answering Felicia's call. At the first mediation meeting, he sat across from Rita looking like a man who had swallowed a stapler. Rita opened with, "Let's talk about the Constitution and how your clients used a Home Depot paint can to violate it." Barry responded by clearing his throat 17 times and offering a plate of sugar cookies. Felicia refused to apologize. She claimed ignorance. She said she had been misled. She insisted that the boat looked abandoned and that community aesthetic standards must be upheld. She also claimed, quite incredibly, that the sticker she used was biodegradable and thus environmentally patriotic. Rita countered with photographs, affidavits from neighbors, and a timeline that highlighted Felicia's refusal to acknowledge multiple warnings. Then she dropped the bomb. The Navy had agreed to submit a letter of interest in the case. The federal government wasn't just watching. They were preparing to intervene if necessary. The look on Barry's face could have curdled cheese. Word spread quickly. The local news picked up the case. The headline read, "HOA in hot water for sinking veterans' boat rights." It was the worst pun Jim had ever seen, and he'd seen some truly awful Navy humor. Still, the article went viral. Veterans groups chimed in online. A retired Rear Admiral posted a statement of support. A TikTok creator with 3 million followers reenacted the incident using Barbie dolls and a toy boat. The internet had declared its verdict before the courtroom ever opened. Back in the neighborhood, loyalties shifted faster than a broken weather vane. Neighbors who once rallied behind Felicia were now holding late-night garage meetings about how to remove her permanently. Jim was invited to speak, but he declined. He wasn't interested in revenge. He wanted reform. If he could dismantle the flawed system and replace it with something fairer, then maybe future residents wouldn't have to choose between silence and warfare. Rita proposed an aggressive legal tactic: subpoena the HOA's financial records, depose each board member, and file a public motion to freeze discretionary spending until the case was resolved. It was a brutal move, but effective. Within 48 hours, half the board resigned. Greg, the secretary, flipped sides entirely and agreed to testify in exchange for immunity from internal penalties. He confessed that Felicia had ignored at least 4 internal warnings and had personally overruled a motion to consult legal counsel before altering the boat. The most surprising revelation came during a closed-door deposition when Greg revealed that Felicia had lied about her military background. She often told neighbors she'd worked with the Department of Defense, hinting at some clandestine liaison role. In truth, she'd spent 2 months temping at the gift shop in a naval museum. Her DoD access badge was a staff lanyard with her name written in glitter pen. Rita sat back in her chair, looked at Jim, and said, "We're going to bury her in footnotes." The HOA scrambled to save face. They offered Jim a formal apology, community-funded restitution, and a plaque for his service. Jim refused all of it, asking instead that the board institute mandatory training on federal laws, veterans' rights, and conflict resolution. He didn't want a monument. He wanted change. That, and for someone to take down the remaining eyesore notices still plastered on mailboxes. The trial date loomed. News vans circled the block, like vultures, sensing a good closing argument. Felicia had gone nearly silent. Her social media accounts vanished. The once daily HOA newsletters had stopped completely. Someone hacked the HOA email and changed the autosignature to "Respect the Boat." No one owned up to it, but Jim had his suspicions. As the courtroom phase approached, Jim found himself preparing the same way he had before operations overseas. He reviewed documents, polished testimony, and stayed calm under pressure. Rita called it battle conditioning. He called it Tuesday. What started as a ridiculous sticker on his windshield had become a public lesson in accountability, and he wasn't going to let it fizzle out with a fine and a slap on the wrist. One night, standing beside his boat under the porch light, he looked at the hull and ran his fingers along the freshly restored tag. It gleamed faintly in the dark. His memories of deployment, salt spray, engine rumble, the sharp bark of orders, came back like a tide. This boat had carried men through storms, trained young cadets, and survived open seas. And somehow, this vessel of honor had almost been sunk by a woman with a clipboard and a grudge. But not anymore. Now it was his symbol, his statement, and soon, thanks to Rita, his legal precedent. The internet didn't just whisper about Boatgate, it screamed. Within 24 hours of the leaked HOA meeting video and court documents, Jim Halloran's boat had become the most recognizable vessel on land. A drone video capturing the sun glinting off the restored hull, with patriotic music layered over it, hit 500,000 views by breakfast. By lunch, a clip of Felicia Carmichael angrily defending her actions on a neighborhood Zoom call, where she mistakenly referred to the Navy as just another government department like Parks and Rec, was turned into a remix called Felicia's National Security Funk. It topped trending charts on 3 platforms. Jim had never been interested in going viral. He didn't even fully understand TikTok. He thought a For You page was just a polite letter. But now, thanks to the momentum of righteous indignation and the unmatched fury of the internet, he was at the center of a media circus. News vans were parked down the street like they were tailgating the Super Bowl. People drove in from other towns just to take selfies in front of the boat. Someone made t-shirts that read, "Don't Trash the Navy," and started selling them from the back of a food truck that had suddenly appeared next to the cul-de-sac. Despite the chaos, Jim remained composed. He refused every interview request. He didn't need to explain himself to the cameras. His boat spoke louder than any statement. What he hadn't expected was the overwhelming flood of support from fellow veterans, service members, and civilians who saw in his story something far more important than a battle over driveway decor. They saw a man standing his ground against a machine that too often bulldozes people without a second thought. But Felicia saw something else entirely. She saw herself slipping from relevance, from control, from the high perch she'd built with years of perfect potlucks, enforcement memos, and passive-aggressive emails about hedges. The house she once ruled now hummed with a soft dread. Her neighbors stopped meeting her gaze. Her inbox overflowed, not with questions about community events, but with public records requests and memes mocking her HOA fashion sense. Her niece called to ask why her name was on a Karen Countdown website. Desperate to salvage her image, Felicia went on a local morning show to share her side. It was a disaster. Dressed in a navy blue blazer meant to look serious, but ending up nautical. She opened with a plea for understanding and promptly confused the Geneva Conventions with a landscaping guideline. The host blinked. Viewers online lost it. Comment sections exploded. She claimed she had deep ties to the military community, then accidentally said her favorite part of boot camp was the snacks. Meanwhile, Rita Pike watched it all unfold with the satisfaction of a woman watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. She had started organizing files for court, but quickly realized public opinion had done more in a week than the entire pretrial phase ever could. Rita had even received calls from other neighborhoods, people wanting advice on ousting overreaching HOA boards, on standing up to unjust rules, on how to find their own metaphorical Jim. But Rita didn't let it distract her. The courtroom phase was still coming, and public noise didn't replace legal weight. So she kept refining her arguments, amassing evidence, lining up witnesses, and drafting motions that would make the judge's jaw tighten with judicial annoyance. Jim, on the other hand, tried to live as normally as possible. He still raked his leaves, still helped old Mrs. Conway across the street when her mail blew away, still waved to kids riding by on bikes. But the normalcy had its cracks. People now treated him like some folk hero. Strangers honked and shouted thanks. A delivery driver asked to see the legendary vessel. One elderly man saluted him from a distance and quietly left a folded American flag on his front step. Jim wasn't used to being anyone's symbol. It made him uncomfortable, even if he appreciated the sentiment. The tipping point came when a Navy-affiliated nonprofit offered to hold a community rally in Jim's honor. They pitched it as a positive event: educational booths, veteran resources, a mobile clinic, even a brass band. Jim hesitated at first, not wanting to fan the flames. But after seeing the list of young cadets who wanted to attend, he agreed. If this circus had to happen, at least it could serve a purpose. The rally, dubbed Patriot Day in the Park, drew hundreds. There were food trucks, flags, veterans from multiple generations, and speeches that had just the right mix of reverence and humor. Jim was pulled on stage and given a plaque, which he tried to politely decline 3 times before someone shoved it into his hands, and the crowd chanted his name until he smiled. Local kids toured the boat, asking questions about its equipment. One even asked if it could float on a pool. Jim laughed and said only if the pool was in the middle of the Pacific. But even in that feel-good moment, tension still simmered. Felicia showed up, flanked by a reporter and wearing sunglasses the size of dessert plates. She tried to approach the stage, waving to cameras, claiming she wanted to celebrate community healing. But someone in the crowd shouted, "You painted a Navy boat with Walmart spray paint." And the chant turned into jeers. The reporter turned his camera away. Felicia left 10 minutes later, unnoticed, except by a 4-year-old who asked if she was the mean lady from the boat. That night, Jim sat alone on his porch again, the plaque leaning against the railing, untouched. The moonlight bounced off the boat's polished surface. It had become something far bigger than he'd ever intended. It wasn't just a vessel anymore. It was a line drawn in the sand. He thought of his old Navy crew, of late nights on the water, of training cadets who'd gone on to serve. He thought of the quiet moments of responsibility, of the discipline no HOA rulebook could ever touch. And now, because one woman tried to assert petty power over something she didn't understand, the whole country knew about his fight. The courtroom battle still waited. The public had chosen sides, but judges didn't work off hashtags. Felicia would still try to twist the narrative, spin it back to her favor. He knew that. But he also knew that the truth was heavy enough to sink lies, no matter how many laws someone pretended to know. He sipped his coffee. In a few days, he'd be standing under fluorescent lights, wearing a blazer instead of a uniform, telling his story under oath. But for now, all he had to do was breathe and let the boat rest easy in his driveway. Tomorrow, the war would be in court. Tonight, the neighborhood slept under a flag of silence, and Jim kept watch, not as a soldier, but as a man who simply refused to let dignity be hauled away by a tow truck. The courtroom smelled like wood polish and overconfidence. Felicia Carmichael sat at the defendant's table dressed in a muted gray suit that tried, and failed, to project humility. She had traded her usual pastel colors for something she believed screamed reasonable authority. But to everyone else, she just looked like a substitute teacher preparing for battle with a room full of lawyers. Her expression alternated between mild disdain and theatrical disbelief, and she kept glancing toward the gallery, as if waiting for a standing ovation that wasn't coming. Across from her, Jim Halloran sat calm and steady, the same way he'd looked while weathering storms on deck, except now his storm was fluorescent lit and armed with subpoenas. Rita Pike stood beside him, her notes organized in color-coded folders, and her reading glasses perched low on her nose. She wore a navy blue blazer with combat boots and a half-smile that never quite disappeared. She didn't believe in opening statements full of theatrics. She believed in momentum. So she stood, adjusted her papers, and began simply. "Your Honor, today we are not here to argue over lawn care or parking violations. We are here because an HOA board, led by Ms. Carmichael, willfully ignored federal law, defaced government property, and attempted to bury their actions beneath neighborhood bureaucracy. And in doing so, they didn't just disrespect my client. They disrespected every American who's ever worn a uniform." The judge, an aging man with a sharp mind and absolutely no patience for nonsense, gave a curt nod. Judge Malcolm Breyer had once served in the Marine Corps and carried a courtroom presence that made everyone sit a little straighter. From the bench, he peered over his glasses and said, "Let's proceed with the facts, not the drama." The facts were damning. Rita started with the timeline. Jim's arrival, the HOA's immediate citation, the documented notice of federal custodianship, the ignored warnings, and finally, the unauthorized defacement of the boat. Exhibit A was a photo of Felicia mid-spray, caught in perfect clarity thanks to a neighbor's doorbell camera. Exhibit B was the federal tag. She'd painted over. Exhibit C was a copy of the Navy's own letter of complaint, signed by a rear admiral. Felicia's lawyer objected weakly, arguing that Felicia hadn't understood the boat's status and had acted with community interest in mind. Rita responded by playing a voicemail from Felicia, left on Greg's phone, in which she said, "If he wants to play the Navy card, then I'll just make the problem disappear." It wasn't just dismissive, it was incriminating. The judge raised an eyebrow. Felicia sank lower in her chair. Witnesses took the stand. First, Greg, the former HOA secretary turned reluctant whistleblower, described the internal meetings where Felicia overruled the board and dismissed legal concerns. Then Helen, the treasurer, testified about the misallocated funds and Felicia's tendency to operate the board like her personal regime. But it was the testimony from Petty Officer Janine Holt, a cadet trainer who'd worked with Jim, that turned the tide completely. Janine stood proud in uniform and spoke with quiet conviction. She explained how the boat had been used to teach navigation and safety to young cadets, how it symbolized opportunity, discipline, and trust. Then she looked straight at Felicia and said, "When you painted over that tag, you didn't just vandalize a boat. You erased something that mattered to a lot of people." The room fell silent. Felicia's defense was a mess of contradictions. She claimed she thought the boat was abandoned. Then she claimed Jim had forged documents. Then she insisted she was simply following procedure. At one point, her lawyer tried to invoke community safety as a justification for her actions. The judge interrupted and asked, "Is spray painting a military vessel in broad daylight your definition of enhancing safety?" There was no answer. In a last-ditch effort, Felicia took the stand. It was theatrical from the first moment. She launched into a speech about neighborhood values, the burden of leadership, and the trials of being misunderstood. But under cross-examination, Rita dismantled her with calm precision. She walked Felicia through each step of her actions, asked her about the bylaws, the notices, the warnings. Then she pulled out a screenshot from Felicia's since-deleted social media, where she bragged about keeping the riffraff in check. "Was Mr. Halloran riffraff, in your opinion?" Rita asked. Felicia hesitated. "I don't recall posting that." "The internet does," said Rita, before turning to the judge. No further questions. Closing arguments were short. Rita summarized the case with the clarity of a knife's edge. She didn't appeal to emotion, just accountability. This isn't about overgrown grass or improper signage. This is about a line that was crossed, willfully, arrogantly, and without remorse. We ask this court to ensure it cannot be crossed again. The defense mumbled something about overreach, community stress, and unfortunate misunderstandings. But no one seemed convinced, not even the defense lawyer. Judge Breyer took a recess. The gallery buzzed with quiet tension. Reporters scribbled notes, and neighbors exchanged wide-eyed glances. Jim sat still, calm as ever. This wasn't about winning anymore. It was about finishing the job. When the judge returned, he didn't drag it out. He stated clearly that the court found the HOA, specifically Felicia Carmichael, liable for defacement of federal property, negligence, and intentional misrepresentation. He ordered a formal apology, restitution to the Navy program, personal fines to be paid by Felicia, and an immediate overhaul of the HOA's bylaws under judicial supervision. He also referred Felicia's actions for possible criminal review by federal prosecutors. Then he looked over his glasses and said, "And Miss Carmichael, for your sake, I hope the next thing you try to paint has nothing to do with national defense." Felicia slumped, eyes wide, lips pressed into a thin line of disbelief. There was no applause, but the silence in the room was louder than any cheer. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Jim emerged quietly, Rita at his side, flanked by reporters who shouted questions he didn't answer. A few neighbors shook his hand. One offered him a slice of banana bread as thanks. The brass band from the rally had returned and softly played Anchors Away in the background. Rita chuckled. Well, you just made history on a technicality involving spray paint and arrogance. Jim gave a small nod. Feels like justice. That night, Jim returned home. The boat was still there, still shining. But this time, someone had tied a small ribbon around the railing, a blue one, with a note that read, "Thank you for standing your ground." Jim read it, tucked it into his pocket, and walked inside. He didn't need victory parties or headlines. He had what mattered. His name cleared, his boat untouched, his neighborhood changed. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone tried to hide behind a clipboard and a rulebook, they'd think twice before messing with the wrong sailor.